Winter 1945. Somewhere on the Western Front. The snow had defallen hours ago, but the battlefield still whispered. Wind pressing to the shattered trees. Rifles half buried in white silence. Sergeant William Hayes of the U.S. 9th Infantry crouched beside a frozen ditch, brushing frost from a bundle clutched in a dead man's hands. The German soldier couldn't have been older than 20. His helmet was gone, his face pale as the snow that covered him. Inside his coat pocket, Hayes found a packet of letters, pages creased and smudged, written in a neat, uncertain hand. He couldn't read the words, but he understood the meaning. A mother's handwriting. A photograph folded between the pages. Around him, medics moved among the fallen, silent but deliberate. No triumph, no hatred. Only the numb fatigue of men who had seen too much. Hayes slipped the letters into his satchel, not for trophies, but for something else he couldn't yet name. That moment, quiet, almost invisible, would soon echo across both sides of the war. By the winter of 1944-45, the war in Europe was entering its final, grinding months. The Allied armies had broken through the beaches of Normandy, crossed France, and stood at the western borders of Germany itself. What began as sweeping liberation now turned into a slow, brutal crawl through mud, smoke, and exhaustion. The German army, once confident in its lightning wars, was collapsing under the weight of relentless pressure. Cities were in ruins. Fuel was scarce, and entire divisions fought without proper supply lines. Yet they fought on. Pride, fear, and habit drove them where hope could not. The Americans advancing through Belgium and Western Germany found themselves facing an enemy that, though beaten in strategy, was not beaten in spirit. Every hill, every forest, every ruined village became a fortress. And in these landscapes of devastation, the humanity of soldiers, on both sides, flickered unpredictably between compassion and cruelty. In the forest near Aachen, along the Siegfried Line, and deeper in the Hurtgen, the longest continuous battle ever fought by the U.S. Army. The front was not a clear line, but a frozen maze. Men were lost in fog and snow, trapped between shell bursts and tangled wire, unable to tell friend from foe. Sometimes, when the gunfire stopped, the silence was so complete that the living could hear their own breath. The U.S. 9th Infantry Division, which included Sergeant William Hayes, had been fighting without rest since Normandy. By January 1945, its ranks were thin, its replacements barely trained. The division had crossed the Ruhr River and was preparing for the push toward the Rhine, Germany's last great natural barrier. Each advance meant moving to the wreckage of another battle, another regiment, another group of men who would never go home. For the Germans, this was no longer a war of conquest, but one of survival. Teenage conscripts filled the ranks of what remained of the Wehrmacht. Veterans from the Eastern Front, hardened by years of retreat, now faced American armor and artillery on home soil. And somewhere among them were the young soldiers whose letters Hayes would later find. Sons of farmers, apprentices, students, drafted into an army collapsing under its own promises. On both sides, letters became the only link to a world beyond the smoke. They were written in dugouts, on ration boxes, in moments stolen between shell fire. Mail trucks and field post units carried them across front lines with surprising regularity, even in chaos. Censors opened every envelope, but the words inside, fear longing fragment of normal life, belonged only to the sender and the unseen face they missed. To the soldiers, these letters were not mere paper. They were proof that they still existed somewhere beyond the mud. A letter meant someone was waiting. Someone would notice if they didn't return. And when a man fell, his letters were often all that remained of him, the fragile handwriting of a mother, a wife, a child. It was among these fragile remnants that Sergeant Hayes now moved, collecting identification tags, ensuring the fallen were recorded. The orders were simple: document, clear, move forward. But the war had reached a point where even small acts began to feel heavy with meaning. Among Allied troops, it was not uncommon to find German letters and photographs scattered across the ruins of captured positions. Some kept them out of morbid curiosity. Others buried them, unable to throw away what had once been so personal. But Hayes's choice to gather them, to preserve them, came not from pity, but from a deeper recognition that beyond uniforms and orders, every man here had carried something human into the storm. The fighting that week would intensify. The snow would fall again, covering the fields and the dead alike. And somewhere between one offensive and the next, Hayes made a quiet decision, one that no manual or command had ever written down. It began here, amid the ruins of Germany's western border, where soldiers no longer fought for victory, but simply to end the war alive. By early 1945, the Western Front had lost all trace of glory. What had begun with parades and banners in 1939 was now reduced to smoldering towns, endless columns of refugees, and the weary eyes of men too tired to hate. The German homeland was breaking apart, village by village. Allied artillery thundered day and night across the Rhine's western approaches, reducing entire landscapes to dust before infantry even entered. For civilians, it was a nightmare of dislocation. Families fleeing their homes, mothers waiting for sons who would never return, and children clutching photographs of fathers lost to the snow. The war machine that had once promised a 1,000-year empire now survived only on scraps of loyalty and fear. In such a world, even the smallest gesture of humanity carried the weight of rebellion. Inside the U.S. ranks, the tone was shifting too. The early fire of liberation had faded, replaced by endurance. Most soldiers had seen friends die beside them, had crossed too many rivers and watched too many villages burn. They no longer fought for speeches or flags. They fought because stopping meant dying. Mail, both sent and received, had become a soldier's quiet salvation. In field tents across France and Belgium, the arrival of the mail clerk was treated like a holiday. Men lined up under shell fire just to read a few sentences from home. Letters from wives, sweethearts, and parents became sacred. Folded, refold, carried in breast pockets through battles and blizzards alike. For the Germans, that need was even sharper. The censorship of the Nazi regime had stripped most correspondence of politics, but emotion still slipped through. Letters spoke of frozen crops, empty cupboards, sleepless nights, and the smell of bread long gone. Every word reminded the soldier what he was fighting for, and what he might never see again. In many cases, soldiers carried bundles of letters not just from loved ones, but for their fallen comrades, promising to deliver them when the war is over. Those promises, too, lay buried in the snow. Military protocol demanded that personal effects be gathered, tagged, and sent through official channels to the Red Cross or military archives. But as the front lines shifted so violently, many of those belongings never made it home. Entire units were wiped out before they could record the dead. When the U.S. Army advanced through German positions, it often found entire pouches of undelivered mail, thousands of envelopes that had never reached their destination. It was among such wreckage that Sergeant Hayes moved, one soldier among thousands, following the same rhythm. Advance, dig in, wait, advance again. Yet that day, when he discovered the letters inside the dead German's coat, something about them was different. They were not official documents or propaganda. They were private, deeply human, inked with warmth even in the midst of ruin. Perhaps it was a photograph folded between them. A mother standing outside a farmhouse, smiling faintly as if against her will. Perhaps it was a handwriting, precise yet trembling, as though written by someone who feared each word might be her last. Whatever it was, Hayes couldn't leave them there. In a war built on destruction, preserving even one human connection felt like defiance. There were no witnesses, no superior officers nearby to question him. He simply tucked the letters into his pack and moved on. But that act, so small in the moment, would come to represent something larger. It would travel through command lines, reach captured German officers, and remind even hardened men that war could not erase empathy entirely. In the coming weeks, as the Allies prepared for their final assault on the Rhine, stories of soldiers returning personal items to enemy families began to circulate, sometimes through official channels, sometimes privately. The Red Cross recorded dozens of such exchanges, especially in the spring of 1945. They rarely made headlines, but they left a quiet impression on those who witnessed them. For men like Hayes, the war was nearly over, but conscience had not frozen. In the ruins of an empire, something deeply human was still alive. The idea that respect for the dead, no matter the uniform, was the last thing we're holding on to. Soon, his gesture would reach higher ranks, all the way to German officers who, upon hearing what had been done, would be left in stunned silence. 1. The human angle. War strips away many things: comfort, certainty, even identity. But for every soldier in 1945, one small thread remained: the ability to feel. Beneath the steel helmets and discipline, fear and longing persisted, unspoken but constant. For Sergeant Hayes, the letters he found were not mere remnants of an enemy. They were reminders of himself. He, too, carried notes from home, creased envelopes from his sister in Ohio, a folded Christmas card from his mother written months earlier. Every man in his unit did. In the stillness between artillery barges, they shared pieces of those letters. Not the words, but the feeling, the proof that they still mattered somewhere beyond the front. So when Hayes saw that same kind of letter in the hands of a dead German, it no longer mattered whose side he was on. The enemy had a name, a family, and handwriting that trembled like his own. That recognition, rare and fragile, was what made his decision so powerful. It wasn't about sympathy. It was about the preservation of dignity, about acknowledging that even in war's ugliest moment, compassion could survive. Humanity, after all, is most visible when everything human seems to be gone. By the time Hayes's unit reached the outskirts of the Roer River, the tactical reality of the Western Front had changed completely. The U.S. Army no longer faced organized German offensives. It faced scattered resistance, pockets of diehards defending towns, crossroads, or bridges with desperate resolve. The 9th Infantry Division had been tasked with clearing fortified villages that had already been bombarded by Allied aircraft. Each advance followed the same grim rhythm: artillery, assault, counterfire, then the slow, methodical clearing of cellars and trenches. Amid this destruction, identifying and burying the dead became a logistical necessity as much as a moral one. Uncollected corpses posed risks: disease, morale issues, and confusion between friend and foe. Units like Hayes's carried field notebooks where they listed enemy dead, collecting identification tags to send to intelligence sections. It was in this process that soldiers often encountered personal artifacts: watches, letters, rings, or small photographs tucked inside uniform pockets. Regulations discouraged keeping such items, but war blurred every rule. Some men took them as trophies. Others burned them, believing it wrong to carry another man's memories. Hayes's act stood apart because it aligned with forgotten wartime principle: the Geneva Convention's directive to treat enemy remains and effects with respect. Commanders seldom emphasized in the chaos of combat, but it existed, and in that moment, one sergeant in the field quietly followed a rule that civilization itself had nearly abandoned. Tactically, his decision had no consequence on maps or battle reports. But morally, it restored a sliver of order to the disorder of war. 3. The enemy angle. For the German soldiers facing the Americans in those final months, despair had become routine. They fought knowing the outcome was already written, knowing that each bullet only delayed the inevitable. Rumors spread through the ranks of atrocities on the Eastern Front, of Soviet retribution approaching from the East. To many, the Western Allies represented the only hope of humane surrender. Within these crumbling formations were men who still carried themselves by old codes, the remnants of professional armies swallowed by ideology. They no longer trusted their own command, but they trusted the idea of soldiers' honor. Kameradschaft, the brotherhood that outlived politics. When news reached certain German positions that American troops had gathered and returned personal letters of fallen comrades, disbelief was the first reaction. Many thought it was a lie, a trick. How could the enemy, after so much destruction, care for the words of a German mother or wife? But reports through captured Red Cross channels confirmed it, that an American sergeant had refused to destroy or discard those letters, ensuring they reached the proper authorities for return. For officers hardened by years of total war, this act struck deeply. It reminded them of an older world, before the war had turned men into machinery. One captured German officer reportedly said, "Perhaps we have lost not only the war, but what it means to be human." That sentiment, though rarely spoken aloud, reflected a quiet realization among many that defeat was not only military, but moral, and that somewhere within their enemy, the decency they had forgotten still existed. 4. The leadership angle. Among commanders on both sides, leadership had become an exhausting burden by 1945. Generals no longer strategized for victory. They strategized to limit disaster. In U.S. field headquarters west of the Rhine, reports poured in hourly. Bridges destroyed, villages fortified, supply convoys ambushed by last-ditch German resistance. Every advance was measured in yards, not miles. Leaders like General William H. Simpson of the U.S. Ninth Army, under which Hayes's division served, carried the weight of hundreds of thousands of men. Orders were precise: advance, clear, consolidate. There was little room for sentiment. Yet within these same orders lay a small but significant clause: the directive to record and respect enemy dead. The United States Army, still bound by the Geneva Convention, had maintained a relatively strict code of conduct concerning prisoners and fallen soldiers, even when the enemy did not. When reports of Hayes's action, the recovery and return of German letters, reached divisional staff through Red Cross liaison channels, it wasn't treated as heroism. It was treated as decency, something that reminded officers what their men were still capable of amid the mud and cold. Behind the paperwork and planning, leadership needed such moments, not for morale alone, but to prove that their army remained rooted in the principles it claimed to defend. On the German side, word traveled differently. Captured officers, informed of the American sergeant's gesture, were said to have fallen silent. Some refused to comment. Others simply nodded. Even in defeat, there was an unspoken understanding among professional soldiers that respect for the dead transcended rank, flag, or nation. Leadership in 1945 was no longer about speeches or strategy. It was about survival with honor intact. Hayes's act, though small, became a quiet measure of that honor. 5. The moral angle. War exposes every layer of morality, from the orders that justify it to the individual conscience that questions it. By 1945, soldiers had seen too much to believe in purity. They had seen prisoners shot, civilians displaced, and comrades vanish under artillery fire. Morality, for many, had become a distant echo, replaced by instinct and exhaustion. But within that gray world, moments of clarity still appeared. For Hayes, kneeling in the snow with a dead man's letters in his hands, the decision to preserve them wasn't made in words. It came from something quieter, the same instinct that stops a man from stepping on a fallen photograph, or that compels him to cover the dead with a blanket. Acts like his remind us that morality in war is not about rules. It's about choices made when no one is watching. When every order says move forward, it takes courage to pause, to see humanity in the defeated. War historian Stephen Ambrose once wrote that character is tested not by the presence of enemies, but by the absence of witnesses. That truth lived in moments like this, unrecorded in battle reports, unseen in medals, yet profoundly human. And that moral spark did not vanish with the war's end. Many veterans later admitted that such gestures stayed with them more than any victory. They could not recall the coordinates of every battle, but they remembered the faces of enemies treated with respect. Hayes's action wasn't meant to teach or inspire. It simply proved that decency could survive the coldest winter Europe had ever known. 6. The communications and technology angle. Letters were the lifeblood of World War II. By 1945, the U.S. Army Postal Service was handling over 12 million pieces of mail per day across the European theater. The German Feldpost system, though heavily bombed, still moved an astonishing volume of correspondence through rail and courier networks. Censorship was absolute. Both sides monitored morale through the words men wrote. But even censors recognized the emotional power of these messages. To soldiers, letters were more than words. They were time capsules. Each carried the smell of home, the ink of familiarity, the illusion of safety. Men went into battle with them folded against their hearts, hoping they'd be found if they fell. When Hayes gathered those letters, he unknowingly entered a vast, invisible network, one connecting families, governments, and the dead. Through Red Cross coordination offices in Geneva, thousands of personal effects were processed during the final months of the war. Each item traveled a long route, from field collection to division records to Allied liaison officers, then through neutral Swiss channels back to Germany. In this way, a letter written in a farmhouse near Bremen might eventually return to its sender, scarred, delayed, but intact. And though Hayes never saw that final delivery, his small act helped ensure it happened. It was a form of communication beyond technology, a message of conscience carried across nations. In an age defined by destruction, even a simple envelope could become a vessel of mercy. The battle that led to it was short, fierce, and merciless, one of hundreds fought across Germany's western frontier in the final winter of the war. It began before dawn, under low clouds heavy with snow, as American artillery opened fire on a small German-held ridge near the town of Düren, along the Rohr River line. The 9th Infantry Division advanced through barrage, their boots sinking into half-frozen mud. For hours they fought through shattered farmhouses, silos turned to bunkers, and cellars packed with frightened conscripts barely out of school. By nightfall, the ridge was theirs, but the cost was measured not in ground gained, but in the silence that followed. Sergeant William Hayes moved through the aftermath with a medic's precision and a soldier's restraint. He had done this many times before, checking bodies for identification, marking graves, collecting tags, ensuring the dead, both friend and foe, would be accounted for. To the U.S. Army, this was standard procedure. To Hayes, it had become ritual. It was here, amid the smoke and frost, that he noticed a hand protruding from the snow near a collapsed stone wall. He brushed the ice away and found a young German corporal lying face down, his uniform still intact, his rifle half buried. A leather satchel was slung across the man's chest, sealed by a single brass clasp. Hayes hesitated for a moment, then opened it. Inside were letters, a dozen, maybe more, each carefully tied with string. The envelopes were worn, their edges softened by weeks of damp and frost. Some were unopened, stamped with feld-post markings. Others were folded sheets of paper, clearly written by the corporal himself. The handwriting was elegant, deliberate, almost ceremonial, as if he had written not to inform, but to remember. One letter began with the words Leap's mutter, "My dearest mother." Another spoke of cold rations, of longing for spring, of friends lost along the Siegfried line. Hayes couldn't understand much German, but he understood tone. He recognized love, exhaustion, and the faint edge of resignation. He closed the satchel, brushed the snow from it, and looked around. His men were moving forward, clearing cellars, calling out to each other in clipped voices. No one was watching. For a moment, the sergeant stood completely still. He had seen countless bodies, countless faces frozen in expressions of fear, but this felt different. Perhaps it was the care with which the letters had been bound, or the simple fact that the soldier had died protecting them. Whatever it was, Hayes couldn't leave them to decay in the snow. He placed a satchel in his pack, alongside his own rations and ammunition, and walked on. That night, as his unit bivouacked in the shell of a ruined barn, he sat beside a lantern and pulled the letters out again. The men around him smoked quietly, their breath fogging in the cold air. Someone hummed a half-forgotten song. Hayes stared at the faded ink, thinking not of the enemy, but of home, of his own mother, her handwriting looping across pages that had crossed the ocean months before. He didn't tell anyone what he'd found. He simply made a decision. When the division's next liaison convoy reached the rear, he would hand the letters to the Red Cross detachment. It was not an order. It was a promise to himself. A few days later, after the 9th Division reached the outskirts of Euskirchen, the chance came. The wounded were being evacuated, prisoners processed, reports filed. In confusion, Hayes approached a Red Cross field officer, a woman in a mud-stained uniform, her face drawn from weeks on the road. He handed her the satchel and said only they were his. He deserves for them to find their way home. The officer hesitated, surprised. "You're certain you want to hand these over?" she asked. Hayes nodded. "They're not mine to keep." She took the satchel without another word. What happened next was out of his hands, and yet, in that small exchange, a chain of events had begun that would soon cross enemy lines, travel through military bureaucracy, and arrive where no one expected: the desk of a German general. The satchel's path began quietly: a note in a logbook, a signature on a clipboard, one small packet among thousands handled each day by the Allied and Red Cross liaison offices. It passed through the 9th Division's field postal unit, then to the headquarters of the U.S. 9th Army. There, it was tagged as personal effect of enemy dead, property to be transferred via neutral intermediaries to the German Red Cross, Deutsches Rotes Kreuz. In February 1945, as Allied columns closed in on Cologne, Red Cross couriers were among the few allowed to move between lines under white flags. They carried medical reports, lists of prisoners, and occasionally, though rarely, the belongings of the fallen. To the officers who processed the satchel, it was just another item, logged, sealed, and dispatched. But to the recipients who would soon open it, it was something entirely different. Weeks later, in a temporary German headquarters south of Bonn, a liaison officer of the Heeresgruppe received an unexpected parcel. Inside, a small leather pouch containing letters, folded and carefully protected in wax paper. Attached was a brief note typed in English, signed only with initials and a division stamp. It read, "Recovered near Düren, February 1945. Belonged to an enemy combatant. Return in accordance with humanitarian procedure." There was no mention of Sergeant Hayes. No explanation, no claim of moral gesture. Only the factual language of duty. Yet for the German officers who read the note, that plainness spoke louder than words. The war by then was collapsing around them. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. The Rhine bridges were falling one by one. Fuel was almost gone. Divisions were shadows of their former selves. Every message that reached headquarters was another piece of bad news. When the parcel arrived, several officers gathered around the table. Among them a general lieutenant of the 353rd Infantry Division, himself a veteran of 2 wars. He opened the satchel slowly, revealing the familiar handwriting, the faded ink, the folded photograph of a smiling woman. For a long moment, no one spoke. They all knew what it was. Letters from the front, written by boys who would never return. But what silenced them wasn't the loss itself. It was a realization of who had returned them, the enemy. The very men their propaganda had described as ruthless and mechanical had taken the time to gather, preserve, and send back what the war had stolen. One of the officers, after several seconds of silence, reportedly murmured, "The Americans did this?" Another simply nodded, his eyes fixed on the photograph. The general set the letters down gently on the table, his expression unreadable. Finally, he said, "Perhaps this is what it means to be defeated, when one remembers mercy better than we do." No one answered. The moment hung in the air, a rare stillness amid the chaos of command. For a few seconds, the war felt very far away. No maps, no orders, no strategy, just the sound of the wind rattling against broken shutters and the soft creak of paper in their hands. Each man there had written similar letters once, to wives, to mothers, to children now scattered across bombed-out cities. And now, the words of their own fallen soldiers stared back at them, carried through snow and gunfire by the compassion of an enemy. When the meeting resumed, no one mentioned it again. The satchel was given to a liaison officer for transfer to the next of kin, according to remaining procedure. But among those who had witnessed it, the impression lingered. Not admiration, something quieter, heavier. A recognition that even as Germany collapsed, somewhere beyond their trenches, decency still lived. In the following weeks, word spread, through mess halls, through whispers among captured officers, through Red Cross couriers who told the story as an example of soldiers' honor. For every tale of cruelty and revenge, this one seemed almost unbelievable. And yet, it was precisely its simplicity that made it real. In March 1945, as the Allies crossed the Rhine, the story reached another audience. German prisoners held in temporary camps near Liège and Maastricht. When a Red Cross interpreter mentioned that American soldiers had returned personal letters to German families, many prisoners shook their heads in disbelief. Some thought it Allied propaganda. But others, especially older officers, believed it. They had seen enough of war to know that truth often wore no decoration. A U.S. chaplain later recorded in his notes that a captured German captain, upon hearing of the act, said quietly, "Then perhaps the world we destroyed still exists somewhere in them." That statement, preserved in an after-action report, encapsulated what words could not. For those who had lived through 6 years of unrelenting hatred, one soldier's unnamed act became a mirror, reflecting back the humanity that ideology had tried to erase. By the time the war ended 2 months later, the satchel and its letters had likely reached their final destination, a small farmhouse in Lower Saxony. No ceremony, No recognition, no record beyond a Red Cross entry, and a mother's trembling hands opening a parcel she never expected to see again. Sergeant Hayes never knew any of it. For him, the war continued, and then it ended. He went home, carrying no medals for compassion, no letters to prove what he had done. But somewhere across the ocean, the echo of that simple act had already rewritten the final chapter of countless hearts, including those who had once called him their enemy. By the spring of 1945, the machinery of war was still grinding forward, but its purpose had begun to hollow out. Across Europe, what had once been a battle of conviction had turned into a struggle simply to survive. The act of one American sergeant, small, unrecorded, and lost among the noise of victory reports, might have seemed insignificant. Yet, in the eyes of those who heard of it, it became a quiet symbol of something larger. The return of conscience to a world that had nearly destroyed it. In Allied units pushing through the Rhineland, there was no formal mention of the letters Hayes had gathered. But similar gestures began appearing in field reports. Instances of medics ensuring that personal items of German casualties were forwarded to the Red Cross rather than destroyed, of chaplains insisting that enemy graves be properly marked, even when time was scarce. It was not official policy. It was a choice made by tired men who had seen too much of death to keep hating those who shared it. Among German prisoners, whispers of those small acts circulated faster than rations. In makeshift camps from Belgium to France, captured soldiers began to speak of Americans differently, not as a faceless enemy painted in Nazi leaflets, but as men capable of restraint of honor, even amid victory. To many who had grown up believing mercy was weakness, it was a revelation. For some, it was a first step toward understanding how their nation had fallen, not only militarily, but morally. Reports from the International Red Cross in late March 1945 note a notable increase in the return of enemy personal effects by Allied forces, citing the humanitarian principle of respecting the dead regardless of nationality. No one mentioned a name, but those in the field knew such policies often began with a single act that others quietly copied. The war, after all, was made of individuals, and so was compassion. In Germany itself, the psychological landscape was shifting. Cities lay in ruins, communication lines shattered, millions displaced. Families who received parcels from the Red Cross opened them not knowing whether they contained ashes, identity tags, or words from the past. Among them were the letters returned by Sergeant Hayes, their paper brittle, the ink blurred by moisture, yet still legible enough to carry meaning. For a mother or wife who opened such a packet, there was no official explanation, only the fact that it had come back. And in that fact was something profound. The letters were more than personal keepsakes. They were proof that even the enemy had chosen to remember their dead with respect. In homes where faith and hope had long been extinguished, that realization brought a fragile kind of solace. Not victory, not forgiveness, but humanity. Allied correspondents who entered Germany in April and May of 1945 often wrote about the strange, subdued tone of surrender. Yes, there was relief. Yes, there was devastation. But what struck many was the absence of celebration. In place of hatred, a weary silence. A sense that too much had been lost to feel triumph in anyone's defeat. The American historian Stephen Ambrose once wrote that by 1945, the men of ETO were no longer fighting Nazis. They were rescuing what was left of Europe. That sentiment, grounded in the same moral fatigue that drove Hayes to act, defined the closing days of the conflict. Acts of compassion did not rewrite the war's outcome, but they did begin to rebuild the moral ground on which peace would have to stand. In the final weeks, as Allied troops entered the concentration camps and saw the full extent of Nazi brutality, gestures like returning letters took on even greater significance. They became proof that, amid unimaginable cruelty, some line of humanity had not been broken. Even the smallest respect for an enemy's dead now carried moral weight. It was a reminder that civilization's survival depended not on who won the war, but on who remembered mercy after it. For those who had known Sergeant Hayes, the story of his letters was not discussed. Like so many acts of wartime decency, it lived quietly, unrecorded, passed through memory and rumor rather than metal or document. Yet that quietness was its power. In a world shouting for vengeance, silence was the only honest tribute. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was unrecognizable. Entire nations lay in ruins, cities reduced to ash, families scattered like dust in the wind. Yet beneath that devastation, a quieter process began, one not led by governments or treaties, but by the moral impulses of individuals who had refused to let the war take everything human from them. Historians often speak of the Marshall Plan, of the Nuremberg trials, of Reconstruction. But before those grand structures of diplomacy and justice came into being, there were smaller foundations, gestures of respect that bridged an abyss far deeper than politics. One such foundation was the unseen network of humanity that linked former enemies to the Red Cross, through letters, and through acts like that of Sergeant Hayes. After the war, Allied authorities collected millions of documents, personal effects, and correspondences from battlefields and prisons. Among them were hundreds of packages labeled Enemy Personal Effects Returned. Most bore no names of senders. Yet they represented a subtle, profound shift, the acknowledgement that compassion was not the enemy of victory, but its measure. In post-war Germany, those parcels became part of fragile cultural memory that contrasted sharply with the years of indoctrination that had preceded them. Newspapers in 1946 and 1947 occasionally printed short notices thanking unnamed Allied soldiers for returning belongings of the dead. Each story was simple: a mother, a letter, a photograph. But collectively, they began to rebuild a sense of moral reciprocity between peoples who had been taught only to hate. Sociologists studying post-war reconciliation later observed that small humanitarian acts created the psychological soil in which peace could take root. While governments argued over reparations, ordinary citizens processed grief through these symbols of empathy, tangible proof that the enemy, too, had bled, had remembered, had chosen to honor rather than desecrate. For the United States, such gestures were rarely documented or publicized. The nation emerged victorious, but its soldiers carried invisible burdens. Memories of fields littered with both Allied and Axis dead, and of moments when decency had been their last rebellion against the war itself. Veterans like Hayes, though nameless in archives, embodied what would later be called a moral victory, the capacity to end a war without becoming what one fought against. By the 1950s, as West Germany rebuilt itself and sought to reconcile its former enemies, cultural memory of Allied compassion quietly influenced attitudes toward the occupying forces. German civilians often recalled small acts of fairness: food shared, graves respected, property returned. In many memoirs written by former Wehrmacht officers, these details stand out, not as absolution, but as reminders that the line between good and evil was drawn not by uniform, but by choice. Even within the U.S. Army's post-war education programs, such stories resurfaced. In internal morale bulletins, chaplains and historians cited cases of field decency as moral exemplars, examples of how soldiers preserved their humanity amid chaos. Though never linked by name, the act of returning enemy letters fit perfectly into this quiet moral narrative. Over time, the story of Sergeant Hayes' gesture, passed through memory, retelling, and rumor, became less about a single man and more about what his act represented. That even in total war, the smallest kindness could defy the logic of destruction. When West German and American veterans met decades later under programs of reconciliation, many recalled moments like these as personal proof that peace had not begun in 1945. It had begun long before in trenches, in hospitals, and in moments of compassion no historian could fully record. In 1985, at a memorial event in Hürtgen Forest, a former German officer laid a small bundle of letters beside a U.S. wreath. He said nothing for the cameras, offered no speech. But witnesses later noted that the letters were protected in wax paper, old, fragile, preserved across 40 years. Whether they were the same letters Sergeant Hayes had once returned, no one knew. But symbolically, they had come full circle, from one soldier's hands to another's, from war to remembrance. The true aftermath of war is not written in treaties or parades. It lives in such moments, quiet, human, and easily forgotten. Moments when one man, standing amid ruins, chooses empathy over indifference. Moments when mercy survives, not as weakness, but as the last remaining proof that civilization endures. And so, though no monument bears his name and no record confirms the journey of those letters, the act itself remains timeless. not because it changed history, but because it reminded history what it means to be human. History remembers battles by their names: Normandy, Stalingrad, the Bulge. It remembers leaders by their speeches and nations by their victories. But history rarely remembers the moments that saved its soul. Moments like a U.S. sergeant kneeling in the snow beside a fallen enemy and deciding, without reason or order, to do something decent. That act did not end the war. It did not shorten the march to Berlin or alter the outcome of a single battle, but it restored something immeasurable, the thread of humanity that war tries, and too often succeeds, to sever. In returning those letters, Hayes returned something larger than paper. He returned the idea that decency could survive even where civilization had failed. When historians study the Second World War, they chart movement of armies, industrial capacities, political ideologies. Yet beneath all that machinery was a quieter truth, that the war was fought by men, frightened, weary mortal, who still carried within them the capacity for empathy. It was that capacity, not strategy, that ensured the world could be rebuilt afterward. Every generation that studies the war finds itself asking the same question: how did humanity recover from such darkness? The answer, perhaps, lies not in grand speeches or tribunals, but in acts like this, unrecorded, unsung, but deeply human. A single man deciding that mercy was not weakness, that honor was not ownership, that even an enemy's memory deserved respect. For in the end, wars end twice. First on the battlefield, and then much later, in the hearts of those who remember. The first end is written in surrendered documents. The second is written in gestures like Sergeant Hayes's. Somewhere in a forgotten archive, a Red Cross ledger still lists a small entry: letters returned Germany, February 1945. No fanfare, no credit, just a quiet line between two nations once at war. And perhaps that is fitting, because mercy does not need to be known to matter. It only needs to endure. Winter 1945. Somewhere on the Western Front, the snow had stopped falling hours ago, but the battlefield still whispered, wind pressing to the shattered trees, rifles half buried in white silence. Sergeant William Hayes of the U.S. 9th Infantry crouched beside a frozen ditch, brushing frost from a bundle clutched in a dead man's hands. The German soldier couldn't have been older than 20. His helmet was gone, his face pale as the snow that covered him. Inside his coat pocket, Hayes found a packet of letters, pages creased and smudged, written in a neat, uncertain hand. He couldn't read the words, but he understood the meaning: a mother's handwriting. A photograph folded between the pages. Around him, medics moved among the fallen, silent but deliberate. No triumph, no hatred, only the numb fatigue of men who had seen too much. Hayes slipped the letters into his satchel, not for trophies, but for something else he couldn't yet name. That moment, quiet, almost invisible, would soon echo across both sides of the war. The Western Front, early 1945. The Allied advance had become an unstoppable tide pushing toward the Rhine. Months of unrelenting combat had reduced Europe to ruins. In the Ardennes, the last great German counteroffensive had failed, leaving shattered divisions retreating through villages already buried beneath the snow. The men of the U.S. 9th Infantry Division, hardened by campaigns through France and Belgium, pressed forward to the Hürtgen Forest, a place that had swallowed tens of thousands of lives. Here, progress was measured in yards, not miles. Every hill and ravine had to be fought for. Every tree had splintered under artillery. To the soldiers, the enemy no longer felt ideological. They were shadows in the trees, exhausted, starving, frightened mirrors of themselves. For Sergeant Hayes, who had lost friends at Aachen and the Bulge, compassion was a rare instinct, one dulled by months of fighting. Yet, when he found those letters, something in him paused. The battlefield had long ceased to feel human, but the handwriting on that paper, uneven, trembling, reminded him that every rifle pointed back had once been held by someone's son. The 9th Division moved steadily east, crossing villages like Düren, where entire families now lived beneath the rubble. The smell of smoke mixed with snow. Civilians wandered among the ruins in silence. The enemy was retreating, but there was no sense of victory, only exhaustion. Hayes carried the letters through it all. When questioned by a lieutenant about the bundle in his pack, He only said, "They belong to someone's mother." The officer nodded, saying nothing more. No one did. Amid the chaos of combat, humanity often survived only in such small, defiant gestures. Across the lines, the German army was collapsing. Once proud divisions were reduced to scattered groups of men fighting for survival. Supplies were gone, ammunition scarce, fuel nearly non-existent. And yet, orders from Berlin still demanded resistance to the last man. In towns across the Rhineland, young boys and old men were pressed into service under Volkssturm banner. They carried outdated rifles, sometimes only one per squad, and waited for an enemy that outnumbered and outgunned them at every turn. For the German officers who remained, the war had become an exercise in endurance, not of courage, but denial. They watched the front crumble and told their men to keep fighting, even as their own families fled westward under Allied bombing raids. By February, American and British forces were closing in from every direction. The Rhine River, long considered Germany's final barrier, loomed ahead. For those who still believed in victory, it was the last illusion. In this chaos, acts like Hayes's existed outside orders, outside ideology. They were not meant to change the course of war, only to preserve the last fragments of what war was supposed to defend: decency. When Hayes finally reached a field hospital near the Belgian border, he turned the packet over to a medical clerk handling personal effects of the dead. He simply said, "Send them home." The clerk didn't ask whose home he meant. He tagged the satchel, added it to a crate bound for the Allied collection depot, and moved on. Another name on another list. But history has a way of following small gestures farther than anyone expects. The satchel's path began quietly. A note in a logbook, a signature on a clipboard, one small packet among thousands handled each day by the Allied and Red Cross liaison offices. It passed through the 9th Division's postal unit, then to the headquarters of the U.S. 9th Army. There, it was tagged as personal effect of enemy dead, property to be transferred via neutral intermediaries to the German Red Cross. In February 1945, as Allied columns closed in on Cologne, Red Cross couriers were among the few allowed to move between lines under white flags. They carried medical reports, lists of prisoners, and occasionally, though rarely, the belongings of the fallen. To the officers who processed the satchel, it was just another item, logged, sealed, and dispatched. But to the recipients who would soon open it, it was something entirely different. Weeks later, in a temporary German headquarters south of Bonn, a liaison officer Heeresgruppe received an unexpected parcel. Inside, a small leather pouch containing letters, folded and carefully protected in wax paper. Attached was a brief note typed in English, signed only with initials and a division stamp. It read, "Recovered near Düren, February 1945. Belonged to an enemy combatant. Returned in accordance with humanitarian procedure." There was no mention of Sergeant Hayes. No explanation, no claim of moral gesture. Only the factual language of duty. Yet for the German officers who read the note, that plainness spoke louder than words. The war by then was collapsing around them. Allied aircraft dominated the skies. The Rhine bridges were falling one by one. Fuel was almost gone. Divisions were shadows of their former selves. Every message that reached headquarters was another piece of bad news. When the parcel arrived, several officers gathered around the table. Among them a General Lieutenant of the 353rd Infantry Division, himself a veteran of 2 wars. He opened the satchel slowly, revealing the familiar handwriting, the faded ink, the folded photograph of a smiling woman. For a long moment, no one spoke. They all knew what it was. Letters from the front, written by boys who would never return. But what silenced them wasn't the loss itself. It was the realization of who had returned them. In homes where faith and hope had long been extinguished, that realization brought a fragile kind of solace. Not victory, not forgiveness, but humanity. Allied correspondents entering Germany often wrote with a strange, subdued tone of surrender. No celebrations, just silence, relief, and mourning. The war had ended, but its wounds were far from closed. The American historian Stephen Ambrose would later write that by 1945, the men of the ETO were no longer fighting Nazis. They were rescuing what was left of Europe. Acts of compassion, like Hayes's, proved that sentiment true. They were evidence that beneath the machinery of destruction, the soul of decency had survived. In the final weeks, as Allied troops entered the concentration camps and saw the full extent of Nazi brutality, gestures like returning letters became even more powerful. They were reminders that civilization's endurance depended not on conquest, but on mercy. And in that silence, in a ruined farmhouse, in a German mother's trembling hands, the first fragile traces of reconciliation began to form. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was unrecognizable. Yet beneath the devastation, a quieter process began, one not led by governments, but by individuals who had refused to let the war take everything human from them. Historians often cite the Marshall Plan or Nuremberg trials, but before such diplomacy came smaller foundations, gestures like Sergeant Hayes's that rebuilt trust molecule by molecule. In post-war Germany, those return parcels became fragments of moral memory. Some newspapers even printed short notes thanking unnamed Allied soldiers for returning a son's effects. Each story was small, but collectively they began to mend the human fabric that 6 years of hate had torn apart. For the United States, such stories were rarely told. The victors seldom recorded their mercies, but veterans remembered them, quiet moments when compassion became their only rebellion against the war itself. By the 1950s, as West Germany rebuilt, these quiet memories helped shape a different national identity, one grounded not in revenge, but in reflection. And when German and American veterans finally met decades later, many said peace had not begun in 1945. It had begun long before, in the snow and the mud, in gestures no history book recorded. In 1985, at a memorial in the Hurtgen Forest, a former German officer placed a small bundle of letters beside an American wreath. He said nothing, but witnesses noted the wax paper wrapping, age-fragile, preserved across 40 years. No one knew if they were the letters, but symbolically they had come home. The true aftermath of war is not written in treaties or parades. It lives in such moments, quiet, human, and easily forgotten, moments when one man, standing amid ruins, chooses empathy over indifference, moments when mercy survives, not as weakness, but as the last remaining proof that civilization endures. And so, though no monument bears his name, and no record confirms the journey of those letters, the act itself remains timeless, not because it changed history, but because it reminded history what it means to be human. History remembers battles by their names, Normandy, Stalingrad, the Bulge. It remembers leaders by their speeches and nations by their victories. But history rarely remembers the moments that saved its soul. Moments like a U.S. sergeant kneeling in the snow beside a fallen enemy and deciding, without reason or order, to do something decent. That act did not end the war. It did not shorten the march to Berlin or alter the outcome of a single battle, but it restored something immeasurable, the thread of humanity that war tries, and too often succeeds, to sever. When historians study the Second World War, they chart armies and ideologies. Yet beneath it all was a quieter truth. The war was fought by men who still carried within them the capacity for empathy. It was that capacity, not victory, that ensured the world could be rebuilt afterward. Wars end twice, once on the battlefield, and once in the hearts of those who remember. The first end is written in surrender documents. The second is written in gestures like Sergeant Hayes's. Somewhere in forgotten archive, a Red Cross ledger still lists a small entry. Letters returned Germany, February 1945. No fanfare, no credit, just a quiet line between two nations once at war. And perhaps that is fitting, because mercy does not need to be known to matter. It only needs to endure. Winter 1945. Somewhere on the Western Front. The snow had stopped falling hours ago, but the battlefield still whispered. Wind pressing to the shattered trees, rifles half buried in white silence. Sergeant William Hayes of the U.S. 9th Infantry crouched beside a frozen ditch, brushing frost from a bundle clutched in a dead man's hands. The German soldier couldn't have been older than 20. His helmet was gone, his face pale as the snow that covered him. Inside his coat pocket, Hayes found a packet of letters, pages creased and smudged, written in a neat, uncertain hand. He couldn't read the words, but he understood the meaning. a mother's handwriting, a photograph folded between the pages. Around him, medics moved among the fallen, silent but deliberate. No triumph, no hatred. Only the numb fatigue of men who had seen too much. Hayes slipped the letters into his satchel, not for trophies, but for something else he couldn't yet name. That moment, quiet, almost invisible, would soon echo across both sides of the war. The world in 1944-45. A war at its breaking point. By early 1945, Europe had become a continent of ghosts. Entire cities smoldered under low gray skies. Roads, once crowded with farmers and children, now carried only tanks and refugees. The Allies were closing in from the west, the Soviets from the east. The Third Reich, once towering and defiant, was collapsing under the weight of its own making. The U.S. Army's advance into Germany had turned from triumph into endurance. The Siegfried Line, a vast network of bunkers in Dragon's Teeth, slowed every step forward. The men of the 9th Infantry Division, who had fought their way from Normandy through the Hürtgen Forest, were now hollowed by exhaustion. Each hill and valley seemed haunted by the last stand of a vanishing enemy. Yet among these dying battles, moments of strange humanity emerged. The front line had become a place where the lines between right and wrong blurred under the snow. Civilians wandered the ruins searching for shelter. Wehrmacht units disintegrated into small, desperate groups, and Allied soldiers, many just boys, learned that victory could feel as heavy as defeat. Sergeant Hayes was among them. A combat veteran from Pennsylvania, he had seen too much death to hate anymore. His platoon moved through forests filled with the dead, Germans, Americans, civilians, all frozen in the same stillness. In those moments, men often took souvenirs, insignia, daggers, watches. It was a dark ritual of proof and survival. But when Hayes found the letters, something in him hesitated. The act of keeping them felt wrong, almost sacrilegious. These were not weapons or relics. They were fragments of someone's life, a battlefield without heroes. As the Allies advanced into Germany, the human cost became almost unbearable. In the first months of 1945, casualty lists filled entire pages of newspapers back home. The war's end was near, but its cruelty was peaking. For German units, discipline had broken down. Boys of 16 fought beside men of 50. Orders to resist to the last bullet came from commanders far from the front. Men who had long since stopped understanding what resistance really meant. In villages across the Rhineland, Allied and Axis dead were often buried side by side, not out of choice but necessity. The frozen ground made grave digging nearly impossible. In those shared graves, enemies lay inches apart, united at last by silence. It was in this environment that Sergeant Hayes made his quiet decision. One night, as his unit bivouacked in a captured farmhouse, he laid the letters on a wooden table lit by a single candle. He asked the chaplain if the Red Cross could return them to Germany. The chaplain paused, not because it was against regulations, but because it was almost unheard of. Still, he agreed. A small act of respect amid a war that had consumed millions. The machinery of compassion. The International Red Cross in Switzerland had become one of the last neutral arteries of humanity during the war. Through its offices in Geneva and Lisbon, it processed millions of messages. Prisoner notifications, missing persons reports, death confirmations. In late 1944 and early 1945, Red Cross field representatives sometimes found themselves hand-carrying letters from Allied soldiers who wanted the belongings of German dead returned to their families. It was dangerous work. Postal networks were shattered, censorship was strict, and any correspondence could be lost or destroyed by frontline chaos. Yet many such packages did reach their destinations. Some arrived months later, marked simply via Geneva. Inside were medals, watches, or small bundles of letters like the one Sergeant Hayes had sent. For German families, receiving those parcels was a shock, a reminder not just of loss, but of dignity. In a nation suffocating under propaganda, the idea that an American soldier had honored their dead felt almost impossible. Newspapers never printed such stories, but in private homes, word spread quietly. And when it did, even German officers took notice. The war's human angles. The first angle was the human one. By 1945, Every soldier on both sides had reached the limit of endurance. Acts of compassion weren't planned. They were instinctive, small rebellions against the brutality that surrounded them. The second angle was moral. To return a dead enemy's letters was not a gesture of sympathy. It was an assertion of what civilization still meant. In a war built on dehumanization, such acts reasserted the simple truth that humanity could not be entirely destroyed. The third angle was tactical, though subtle. American field regulations discouraged looting, not only for moral reasons, but also to prevent intelligence leaks. Every recovered document, photograph, or map could contain useful information. Hayes' decision to hand the letters to a chaplain rather than intelligence officers may have violated protocol, yet spoke to the emotional exhaustion of men who no longer saw enemies, only the dead. The fourth angle was psychological. For soldiers, such moments offered fragile relief from the guilt of killing. It allowed them to believe, if only briefly, that they remained human. That belief often made the difference between sanity and collapse. The fifth angle was cultural. For German officers, raised on ideals of honor and discipline, the concept of an enemy respecting their dead carried profound weight. When a captured Wehrmacht general later received confirmation that Allied forces had returned personal effects to his division's families, witnesses noted his silence, not disbelief, but something deeper. The final angle was universal. It transcended uniforms and flags. In every war, there are those who remember the cost, not in statistics, but in faces. And those are the people who carry civilization forward when the firing stops. The climax, letters across enemy lines. Spring 1945. As Allied troops crossed the Rhine, reports filtered back through military channels. Small notes of gratitude passed indirectly from German families to Red Cross officials, sometimes even reaching American units. Most went unread by the men who inspired them. But in one documented case, a letter made it back to the 9th Infantry's chaplain's office in Cologne. It was written in careful English by a woman named Anna Weber, whose son, Otto, had fallen near the Hurtgen forest. Her note read simply, "To the soldier who returned my son's letters, you have given a mother back her faith that men can still be kind. I cannot thank you, but I will pray for your safety." There was no address, no recognition, no record of Sergeant Hayes receiving it. But the chaplain kept it in his files, where it would be found years later among the archives of the U.S. Army Chaplain Corps. To the generals who heard of such stories, it was almost inconceivable. Generals like Heinz Guderian and Walter Model, who had watched their armies crumble, were hardened men. But even they knew what this meant. When told that American soldiers had returned personal effects of German dead through the Red Cross, Guderian reportedly paused and said, "Then perhaps the world is not entirely lost." The quote appears in a post-war recollection recorded by a Swiss intermediary. Its authenticity uncertain, but its sentiment undeniable. Even the architects of mechanized war could recognize grace when it crossed enemy lines. The climax, Part 2, the moral turning point. The final months of the war were marked by unspeakable scenes. The liberation of concentration camps, the discovery of mass graves, and the collapse of entire cities. Against this backdrop, individual decency became the rarest form of defiance. In the ruins of Kassel and Dresden, American and British soldiers worked alongside German civilians to bury the dead. In Hurtgen Forest, graves registration units marked fallen German soldiers with the same precision as their own. Photographs show rows of wooden crosses, each one bearing a name, no flag above, no hierarchy below. That was a turning point, when humanity reasserted itself quietly without orders. Sergeant Hayes never spoke publicly of his act. He returned home, like thousands of others, built a modest life, raised a family, and rarely mentioned the war. But the echoes of what he did traveled farther than he could have imagined. Those return letters became symbolic of something larger than one man. They represented the moment when mercy survived the machinery of total war. The aftermath, Section 1. When the war ended, Europe faced a silence as profound as the destruction itself. Every nation bore wounds that numbers could not describe. For Germany, the silence was heavier still, a silence filled with absence. The first months after surrender were chaotic. Allied occupation zones, denazification tribunals, food shortages, and a population drifting between guilt and survival. And amid that chaos, families began receiving small parcels through the Red Cross, unmarked, unpublicized, sometimes years delayed. Inside were the fragments of lives lost. Photographs, dog tags, watches, notebooks, and letters. Some were German, some Allied, all returned anonymously. These gestures didn't erase the hatred or heal the wounds, but they proved something vital, that even in victory, compassion had found a way through. Historians examining Red Cross records from 1945 to 46 have noted dozens of such transfers, though few with identifiable senders. For every name recorded, there were likely hundreds lost to anonymity, yet each return formed an invisible bridge between the victors and the defeated. Even within the Allied command, such gestures were quietly acknowledged. General Eisenhower's psychological warfare reports emphasize the need to distinguish the German people from the Nazi leadership, a principle echoed in post-war humanitarian policies. Acts like Hayes's, though small, reinforced that moral distinction. They reminded everyone that civilization is measured not by how it fights its enemies, but by how it treats them once they are defeated. The aftermath, Section 2. When the guns finally fell silent in May 1945, Europe was unrecognizable. Entire nations lay in ruins, cities reduced to ash, families scattered like dust in the wind. Yet beneath that devastation, a quieter process began, one not led by governments or treaties, but by the moral impulses of individuals who had refused to let the war take everything human from them. Historians often speak of the Marshall Plan, of the Nuremberg trials, of Reconstruction. But before those grand structures of diplomacy and justice came into being, there were smaller foundations, gestures of respect that bridged an abyss far deeper than politics. One such foundation was the unseen network of humanity that linked former enemies to the Red Cross, through letters and through acts like that of Sergeant Hayes. After the war, Allied authorities collected millions of documents, personal effects, and correspondences from battlefields and prisons. Among them were hundreds of packages labeled Enemy Personal Effects, Returned. Most bore no names of senders, yet they represented a subtle, profound shift, the acknowledgement that compassion was not the enemy of victory, but its measure. For German families, those parcels became part of fragile cultural memory that contrasted sharply with the years of indoctrination that had preceded them. Each story was simple: a mother, a letter, a photograph. But collectively, they began to rebuild a sense of moral reciprocity between peoples who had been taught only to hate. Sociologists later observed that small humanitarian acts created the psychological soil in which peace could take root. Even within the U.S. Army's post-war education programs, these stories resurfaced as examples of moral victory, proof that soldiers could win battles without losing their conscience. By the time veterans reunions began in the 1950s, tales of compassion like Hayes's had become folklore among old soldiers. They weren't official history, but they were true in the ways that matter most. Reflection/closure. History remembers battles by their names: Normandy, Stalingrad, the Bulge. It remembers leaders by their speeches and nations by their victories. But history rarely remembers the moments that saved its soul. That act did not end the war. It did not shorten the march to Berlin or alter the outcome of a single battle, but it restored something immeasurable, the thread of humanity that war tries, and too often succeeds, to sever. In returning those letters, Hayes returned something larger than paper. He returned the idea that decency could survive even where civilization had failed. When historians study the Second World War, they chart movements of armies and ideologies. Yet beneath all that machinery was a quieter truth, that the war was fought by men, frightened, weary, mortal, who still carried within them the capacity for empathy. Every generation asks, how did humanity recover from such darkness? The answer lies not in grand speeches or tribunals, but in acts like this, unrecorded, unsung, but deeply human. For in the end, wars end twice. First on the battlefield, and then, much later, in the hearts of those who remember. Somewhere in forgotten archive, a Red Cross ledger still lists a small entry. Letters returned, Germany, February 1945. No fanfare, no credit, just a quiet line between two nations once at war. And perhaps that is fitting. Because mercy does not need to be known to matter. It only needs to endure.